The wind cut across the valley like a blade, sharp and merciless. The snow fell in thick, swirling curtains, covering every sound except the crunch of boots on frozen ground. That was the sound she heard behind her as her father pushed her forward, his hand firm between her shoulder blades. "The debt's paid," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. The debt was her. She was the final entry in a ledger book filled with flour, salt, and shame. Her father, a preacher who preached about mercy but never showed it, had sold her to clear his name in town. She stumbled on the icy trail, her bad leg throbbing with pain. Every step reminded her of her father's temper, the one that had left her scarred and limping for life. The man waiting for them was a shadow against the gray sky. He was tall and wide, wrapped in a coat made of animal pelts, his face half hidden by a thick beard. Some said he lived with wolves. Some said he had killed a man and run to the mountains to escape the noose. They called him the mountain ghost, the man no one dared speak to. Her father didn't say another word. He just shoved the worn leather strap of her satchel into her hand and walked away. His figure disappeared into the storm without a single glance back. The man said nothing. His eyes were pale blue, cold and still like a frozen lake. He gave one short nod, then turned and started walking toward a cabin tucked deep among the pines. He didn't look to see if she followed. He simply expected it. She did. Each step she took behind him felt like walking toward the end of the world. When they reached the cabin, she braced herself for darkness and filth, but inside it was clean, too clean. Firewood was stacked neatly by the hearth. A small tin cup sat beside a single plate on a rough wooden table. The smell of pine and smoke filled the air. Everything had its place. Everything was quiet. He pointed toward a small cot in the corner, a thin blanket folded at the foot. "That's yours," he said, his voice deep but not cruel. She nodded, clutching her satchel close, not trusting her voice to answer. He turned back to the fire, poking the embers until they flared, orange and angry. She watched him from her corner, unsure what was expected of her. He moved with quiet purpose, each step, each motion sure and controlled. The silence between them was heavy, but not hateful. When night came, the cold crept through every crack in the logs. She shivered under the thin blanket, her teeth chattering. She tried not to cry. Then, without warning, she felt something heavy and warm fall over her. A thick wolf pelt, soft and smelling faintly of the wild. She froze, waiting for a hand, a word. But there was nothing. Only the sound of his boots as he went back to the fireside. He sat down, his back turned, silent again. It was not tenderness, it was necessity. But to her, it was the first kindness she had felt in years. The next morning the sun rose pale and cold. He was already gone. She saw his tracks in the snow leading into the woods. When he returned, his arms were full of logs. He chopped wood until sweat froze on his brow, then skinned 2 rabbits and cooked them over the fire. He didn't speak, but when he placed a bowl of stew on the table in front of her, she understood. It was an offering, not a command. Days passed. The silence between them became a language. He moved through the cabin and woods like he belonged to them. She moved softly, watching, learning. She saw how he listened to the wind, how he paused when hawks circled overhead. He was not mad, as the townsfolk said. He was listening to the mountain, to the quiet, to something she could not hear. One evening, as she tried to warm her hands near the fire, the flames flickered low. She was too afraid to touch the woodpile. The door creaked open. Snow gusted in. He stood there, his coat dusted white. His eyes flicked to her, then to the dying embers. "You were cold," he said. It was the first time she had heard his voice clearly. Deep, rough, but calm. She nodded. The sound of his voice filled the cabin like warmth. He added logs until the flames grew tall again. She sat quietly, staring into the light. That night, he carved something out of wood. His hands were sure, patient. The next morning, she found it on the table by her bowl of porridge. A small bird, wings spread, carved from pine. Its feathers were etched with care. It was beautiful. She ran her fingers over it, feeling the smooth wood, Her throat tightened. It wasn't a gift, not in the way people gave gifts in town. It was a message, a quiet one that said, "I see you." From that day, something began to shift. She mended one of his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat. He said nothing but wore it the next day. When she hummed softly while sweeping the floor, the rhythm of his axe outside slowed, like he was listening. Then one night she woke from a nightmare, her father's voice still echoing in her head. The fire had gone low, the cabin shrouded in shadow. She thought she was alone until she saw a shape by the doorway. Tall, still. He was standing guard. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there until her breathing steadied, until she fell back into uneasy sleep. By morning, the snow was falling again, and she looked at him differently. He wasn't just a myth or a beast of the mountains. He was a man. And somewhere beneath that silence and those scars, there was a gentle heart beating, one that might just be learning to care again. Winter pressed harder against the mountains. The wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal, and snow lay thick upon the ground, swallowing paths and sound alike. Days became weeks, and the cabin became their whole world. The mountain man rose before dawn every day, his shadow moving through the faint light of the fire as he packed his traps or checked the snares. She watched him sometimes, pretending to sleep, seeing how careful he was with his tools, how he moved with a quiet patience that didn't belong to the cruel world she'd come from. He spoke little, but his silence was no longer cold. It was steady, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. When he returned with game, she cooked beside him. When she cleaned the cabin, he chopped wood. Their lives began to move in rhythm, two souls stitched together by survival and quiet understanding. One morning, she woke to find something unusual. On the table beside her porridge bowl lay a piece of pine, carved smooth into the shape of a bird with wings stretched wide. It was delicate, beautiful, and impossibly detailed. She ran her fingers over the carved feathers, her heart tightening in her chest. It was not just wood. It was something more, a piece of his silence, turned into kindness. The days passed in gentle repetition. When she hummed softly while sweeping the floor, the rhythm of his axe outside would slow, as though he was listening. When she mended his torn shirts, he said nothing, but wore them the next day. No words were spoken, but something warm had begun to grow in that frozen wilderness. One evening, as the snow thickened outside, he washed at the basin near the fire. She turned away out of habit, but then she saw it. A deep, jagged scar ran from his shoulder blade down to his waist. It looked like an old burn, the skin uneven and rough. Her hand went unconsciously to her own twisted ankle, the mark of her father's violence. They were both scarred, both survivors of someone else's cruelty. That night, she couldn't sleep. Memories clawed their way out of the dark, her father's voice booming, the sharp crack of the board against her leg, his sermons about obedience and sin. She woke with a gasp, the air torn from her lungs. The fire had gone out, the cabin swallowed in shadows. Then she saw him. He was standing in the doorway again, silent as stone, watching over her. He didn't move or speak. He just stood there until her breathing slowed. It was enough. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. The next morning, something had changed. When she smiled faintly at him across the table, he almost smiled back. Almost. Later that week, a strange thing happened. A wolf appeared at the edge of the clearing. Its fur was silver gray, its eyes bright and intelligent. It moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a creature that feared nothing. She froze at the open doorway, her breath white in the air. The mountain man was outside, splitting logs. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stood still, watching. The wolf lowered its head, sniffed the air, then looked straight at her. For a long moment, their eyes met. There was no fear there, no threat, only a kind of quiet knowing. Then, as if satisfied, the wolf turned and vanished back into the trees. When she looked back at the man, his eyes were on her, not the wolf. "You belong here," he said simply. Her chest ached at the words. It was the first time anyone had ever said them to her. The days after that felt lighter. She found small joy in the chores she once dreaded. She learned to mix herbs into the stew, to mend boots with careful stitches, to laugh softly when the old cabin door stuck again. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was peace. But peace, in the wild, never lasts long. It began one afternoon with a distant sound, hooves. The echo carried faintly through the snow-draped pines. By dusk, they saw a rider through the white blur of falling snow, a man on a tired horse, half frozen and desperate. The mountain man opened the door, wordlessly letting him in. It was the law of the wilderness. You never turn away a soul from the storm. The stranger was a trapper. His beard was thick with ice, his eyes darting like a man who'd spent too long in dangerous company. He drank greedily from the tin cup she handed him, his breath reeking of whiskey and fear. "Much obliged," he said, glancing between them. "Blizzard caught me near the ridge. Thought I'd freeze before morning." He talked as he warmed his hands by the fire. Talked too much. He spoke of the town down in the valley, of a preacher whose voice could turn men into mobs. He spoke of a young woman the preacher claimed had run away with the devil himself, a witch who had cursed her own father and disappeared into the mountains. Her stomach turned to ice. She knew who he meant. The trapper went on, oblivious. "They say there's a bounty on her now. The preacher's paying good money to have her dragged back for justice. Hired a hunter from Missouri. Cold eyes, colder heart. Man don't stop till he finds his prey." The cabin fell silent. The trapper chuckled at his own story, not noticing how pale she'd gone, or how the mountain man's hand had closed into a fist. When the storm cleared, the stranger thanked them and rode out. The moment he was gone, the air inside the cabin grew heavy. The mountain man stood still for a long while, staring into the fire. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark. The quiet peace they had built had just been shattered by the world she had fled. "Pack your things," he said at last, his voice low and hard. "They're coming." She looked at him, this man who had once been nothing but silence and mystery, and saw something new in his eyes. Not fear, protection. He moved to the corner, pried up a wooden plank in the floor, and drew out a long rifle wrapped in oiled cloth. It was old, but well cared for. A soldier's weapon. He checked the sights, then looked up at her. "You stay inside," he said, "and keep the fire low." But the girl who had once been sold like a debt was no longer helpless. She reached for a piece of charcoal from the hearth and knelt down. On the floor, she drew a quick map of the mountain, the trails, and the narrow ravine she'd discovered while gathering firewood. When she was done, she pointed to a place marked with an X. He studied the map, then her face. She wasn't afraid. He gave a single nod. This was no longer just his fight. It was theirs. The storm passed, but the mountain held its breath. The air grew sharp and brittle, the kind that cracked branches and froze rivers solid. The cabin stood quiet in its clearing, smoke rising thin and straight into the sky. For 2 days, they waited. He checked the traps and reinforced the hidden snares along the trail. She stayed inside, keeping the fire small, her eyes fixed on the window. At night, she heard wolves howling in the distance, their calls echoing through the frozen valley like a warning. On the 3rd morning, they came. 3 riders, dark shapes moving through the snow. The man in front rode tall and still, his coat heavy with frost, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. The bounty hunter. Behind him rode 2 men with rifles slung across their backs. They were loud, careless, their voices cutting through the silence like knives. The mountain man moved through the trees like a shadow. His rifle rested across his back, but in his hands he carried something else. A heavy iron bar. He had no wish to kill. He had seen enough death for 1 lifetime. He only meant to send them back down the mountain broken in spirit and fear. He reached the ravine just as they entered it, a narrow, twisting path where the snow clung heavy to the rocks. From above he could see their horses slipping, hear the men cursing under their breath. He waited, still as stone, until they were all in the choke point. Then he struck. The iron bar slammed against a cluster of loose rocks she had marked for him. The earth groaned. The hillside gave way in a roar of thunder and falling stone. Snow and boulders crashed down the slope, sealing the path in front of and behind them. One horse reared, screaming. A man shouted for help as another tumbled into the drift. The bounty hunter swore, pulling himself free, his eyes burning with rage. He climbed out of the slide, coughing, his hat gone, his face pale beneath a jagged scar on his cheek. He drew his pistol and started toward the cabin, furious and unshaken. Inside, the girl waited. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her fear no longer ruled her. The mountain man's rifle leaned against the wall. She could hear the snow crunch outside, the steady approach of boots. The door burst open. The bounty hunter stood there, his pistol raised, his breath fogging the air. His voice was cold and sure. "Where is she, devil? The town wants its property back." The mountain man stood in the center of the room, calm, unmoving. His hands were empty. His eyes met the hunter's. "She's no one's property." Before the hunter could answer, a voice came from the corner near the hearth. "It's over." The girl stepped into the light. The fire glowed behind her, catching the red in her hair, the determination in her eyes. The bounty hunter's hand trembled slightly. She was not what he expected. "I'm the one you're after," she said, her voice steady. "The witch they told you about." Quote. He hesitated, the gun wavering. Slowly, she reached down and lifted the hem of her dress to her knee. The twisted, discolored scar on her leg shone in the firelight, raw and permanent. "This is what my father gave me," she said, "for disobedience, for smiling at a man he didn't approve of, for being alive in a way he couldn't control. This is the mark of his house." The bounty hunter stared. He had heard the preacher's story, the wicked daughter, the sinner hiding in the mountains. But the truth before him was different. It was not evil he saw, but suffering. The mountain man's voice rumbled low, steady. "I had a wife once," he said, "and a daughter. They burned our house down because my wife could read and used herbs for healing. They called it God's justice. This," he gestured to the thick scar across his back, "is what their justice left me." The silence that followed was heavy as stone. The bounty hunter's jaw tightened, his eyes shifting from the girl's leg to the man's scar. The truth hit him like a hammer. He holstered his gun. "The debt's paid," he muttered, voice cracking. He backed out of the doorway, his boots crunching softly in the snow. Without another word, he mounted his horse and disappeared into the white wilderness. The quiet that followed was clean, like air after a storm. The fire crackled, warm and alive. The mountain man stood still for a moment, then turned toward her. "It's over," he said. She nodded, tears bright in her eyes. For the first time, the silence around them felt safe again. Days passed. The snow deepened. The danger was gone, but something new had taken root. They began to rebuild what had been disturbed, their peace, their rhythm, their strange, quiet bond. One evening, they sat together by the fire. He was carving again, his hands steady. She was mending a blanket, her stitches neat and sure. The flames danced between them, soft and golden. He set down his knife. "The winter is long," he said quietly. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. She looked up at him, her heart steady. "I'm not cold anymore." For a moment he said nothing. Then a faint smile touched his lips, small and honest. He rose, went to the mantel, and returned with a small box carved from cedar. From it he took a simple silver ring set with a smooth river stone. "It was my mother's," he said, placing it on the table between them. He didn't ask her to wear it. He didn't have to. She slid the ring onto her finger, the metal cool against her skin. "It fits," she whispered. The following spring the cabin changed. He built a porch with 2 chairs that faced the sunrise. A small garden bloomed by the door, full of herbs and wildflowers. The wolves sometimes watched from the tree line, calm and curious. He laughed now, quietly, but real. And when she hummed her mother's old tune, he joined her, tapping the rhythm on the table with his rough, scarred fingers. They had built something out of brokenness, not from grand promises, but from simple things. A mended shirt, a carved bird, a wolf pelt shared in silence, a ring made of stone. The mountain had given them its verdict. They belonged.